Kevin Durant was the news of the day when I woke up late last night. Kevin Durant had been traded from the Brooklyn Nets to the Phoenix Suns. And as I sat there and just drank in the NBA trade deadline like a high-powered fire engine's water hose shoved down my throat, I got to thinking about normies. What Rush Limbaugh used to call drive-by news consumers. What on Twitter are people that are described, those who don't, stay to the minute-to-minute machinations of the political news cycle, the latest controversy, the latest scandal, and the latest bit of news that Twitter has begun to refer to as normies. And we here on the Will Cain podcast have talked about in terms of riding along the wave of the news without really ever digging in your rudder to understand exactly what's happening around you, letting the world wash over you, floating into a manipulated reality. Let me start with this. Normies or drive-by news consumers are not to be condescended, are not to be dismissed, are not to be mocked. Normies or drive-by news consumers are, in most cases, in my estimation, people living their life, raising their families, going to their job, starting their business, not waiting for the latest tweet. Normies are virtuous people more often than not, out there living life. Yes, there are some people that are way too consumed with perhaps what happens at the Grammys or what happens at the NBA trade deadline, that they never take a moment to actually look at the news that matters. But for the most part, I think that drive-by news consumers are people that are actually worried about their kid's soccer game, worried about their next paycheck, worried about inflation at the grocery store. But they have to be understood, and they have to be persuaded. I thought about that during the State of the Union. Joe Biden on Tuesday night gave the nation his estimate on where we currently stand in the United States. It's easy to look at that speech and to once again pull a few clips where Joe Biden, sort of slurs words together into incomprehensible lingo and make fun. But the truth is, I think Joe Biden actually exceeded whatever low bar has been set by Joe Biden. But still, if you were a casual news consumer and you happen to tune in for 10 to 15 minutes of the State of the Union, Joe Biden probably exceeded your expectations. And from a policy perspective, he began to moderate. He started to echo some themes, in fact, of Donald Trump. He almost began to sound like a populist. Now, populism comes easy to progressives. Populism comes easy to the left. It's an unmoored ideology. It's not grounded in any particular principle. That's not slander. That's fact. It rides upon the wave of the current thing, does progressivism, and describes it as always a step forward. But it is totally unmoored by principle, and therefore it can freely pursue populism, whatever makes the most people happy. But what's happened to progressivism is it doesn't even reflect populism. It only increasingly reflects the popularity of what's happening in the current thing on places like Twitter. It's not populism to think that boys can be girls. It's not populism to chop off genitalia. It's not populism to describe the nation as racist. It's simply popular in some powerful niche quarters. But what Joe Biden began to do on Tuesday night, even in really honestly nonsensical issues like getting rid of junk fees from airline tickets, is begin to play a form of populism that does happen to resonate with normies. When you combine that with the fact tonally, he exceeded the low bar of expectations and comes across as a moderate in tone, you see the path to an announcement for Joe Biden to be the Democratic nominee for president in 2024. And I don't think the power of that combination of populism and moderation should be dismissed when your opponent will be described as an extremist. I don't think we can dismiss the power of that image with the normie. Whatever went into the election of 2020, Joe Biden was seen by many as the moderate alternative to Donald Trump. Whatever happened in the midterm elections of 2022, the public chose to continue to ride the wave of the drive-by news cycle. I tell you this because I think that we who are plugged in, we who pay attention to Hunter Biden's laptop, we who see the latest Project Veritas video on the manipulation of the public on the COVID vaccine, all too often overlook the power and the attention and the focus of the normie. I think that's been made all the more aware as you watch what's happening on Capitol Hill right now, when big tech corporations, Twitter in particular, has been called before a congressional panel to discuss the Twitter files and how Twitter colluded with big government, the FBI, various entities within the government structure, CISA. There's so many acronyms, it's hard to keep track, to turn up and turn down and turn off some voices on Twitter. Now, this is a massive deal, and not one we have to belabor because we've talked about it here on a regular basis. If you listen to the Will Cain podcast, you're not a drive-by news consumer when it comes to the way that your mind has been manipulated, when it comes to the way that certain voices have been censored. You know. But the question is, to what extent does the normie know about what happened with Twitter files? Because the Twitter file story has received a total blackout from corporate mainstream media. It's not covered by CNN. It's not covered by the New York Post. It's not covered by the Washington Post. And you and I, once again, both know that's not a reflection of its newsworthiness. That's not a reflection of its import. You know, manipulating the American mind as to who was considered moderate in a presidential election, who was considered extreme, who was considered a conspiracy theorist, who's so out there when it comes to Ukraine that they should be censored, what's acceptable consensus when it comes to the medicine you inject into your children, is of obvious import, is of obvious newsworthiness. But it's received a total media blackout, has the Twitter files. So how much of it breaks through to the casual news consumer? I'm not optimistic. And it's sadly, that pessimism has no correlation to the importance of the normal person understanding the way they have been manipulated. Look, if the normal person rides upon the wave of news, accepts some certain level of credibility, accepts some certain level of trustworthiness, if they pay attention to their family and take their kids to practice and go about their job and don't have time to dive into Seymour Hersh's Substack on the truth behind the bombing of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, then they have to be able to accept that there is some truth, some common truth to be found, to be shared, that isn't censored. I don't know if you saw that story this week. Seymour Hersh, a famous New York Times investigative reporter who's been not without his controversy throughout his career, published on his Substack a very, very in-depth reported piece from anonymous sources. We should always remember and appropriately value anonymous sources, but from anonymous sources on who bombed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And his conclusion, his reporting are clear. The United States of America. Now listen, that plays into logic and common sense. I mean, you and I could sit here and play the clips of Victoria Nuland or Tony Blinken or Joe Biden essentially saying that they would bomb the Nord Stream 2 pipeline if Russia invaded Ukraine. I mean, Joe Biden's direct quote was, I believe it will come to an end, or there will be no Nord Stream 2 pipeline, one way or another. He and Newland both said something directly to that effect. And it's, when you follow incentive, who had the incentive to bomb the pipeline that delivers natural gas from Russia to Europe, that it's clear it's not in the interest of Europe, despite what we were told, and told here on the Will Cain podcast by some, it's not in the interest of Russia to self-sabotage their own pipeline, not to drive up global prices in other markets for which they could sell. No, they want to be able to deliver a captured market to Europe. It's logic, it's incentive, it's common sense, and now it's reported. What it was reported was that the U.S. had been debating it for quite some time, looking at different mechanisms to do so. They understood how covert it needed to be because, in their piece it's quoted, it would be considered an act of war. It's a really fascinating piece where it talks about, does Seymour Hersh, that for many, many years, I believe in the 1970s and 1980s, a U.S. underwater elite dive team, not connected to the Navy SEALs, was involved in like a decade-plus long covert operation where they found a communication device, a Soviet communication device that ran along underwater cables where generals talked freely about their approach, I believe, in the North Pacific. We found out about this, and instead of destroying it, what we did is we ran these divers down to depths, insane depths, and essentially tapped the line. And we listened in for like 14 years to Russian communications openly chatting about classified geopolitical warfare information. And it was like that forever until we had our own double agents ratted out, and it ended, I believe, in the 1980s. Well, this underwater dive team that is stationed apparently in Panama Beach, Florida, was ultimately the call by the CIA on who to deal with this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And in big partnership with Norway, had to alert the Danish and the Swedish as well, but in big partnership with Norway, we ran a subversive, every year there's, for 21 years, this operation in the Baltic Sea, and this was embedded within it. And off this coast of an island, I believe a Danish island, down went this elite dive team to plant C4 on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But Joe Biden didn't want it to be just a day or two before it went off. So he requested that they develop some type of remote detonatable trigger. And so they planted it, I believe, in June, and they left. And then what happened is, in order to trigger it, come September, a plane co-opted by the United States government dropped a buoy in the vicinity of the location of the C4. That buoy then, remotely triggered at the direction of the President of the United States, could remotely detonate the C4. And in September, we have the explosion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with plausible deniability, months removed from any presence in the Baltic. And in the incentive, common sense, and logical outcome that was promised by Joe Biden. It's a fascinating piece by Seymour Hersh. But the point I'm getting at, and why I'm talking about it now, is that prospect that we were the ones that bombed Nord Stream was called conspiracy. I talked about it in guest hosting for Tucker Carlson. Others like Tucker Carlson talked about it as well, just following logic and incentive. And of course, we were dismissed as stooges of Putin. Right along the wave. Accept the falsehood. Call the truth conspiracy. That's the message. That's the wave. That's what washes over you as a normie. You have to dig your rudder in to find the truth. You know, I was listening to local Dallas sports talk radio this week. It always has a way of really pissing me off. They were talking about the Grammys. All right, I was thinking about this, the Sam Smith performance at the Grammys. You saw that? Sam Smith dressed up, like the devil, all in red, skin-tight stuff, top hat, horns, surrounded by demons, dancing all around the entire theater of the Grammys, in red. And it's like, here we have, the ultimate event programmed for the casual consumer, elevating, devil worship. And on one hand, you go, okay, why should we get outraged? That's what Sam Smith wants. He wants us to get outraged, right? On the other hand, you think, like I did when I was in that bar in New York City a few weeks ago, I told you about here a few episodes ago, we might draw a decent line in society when we go, no. No on the devil. No on Satan. It's a decent line to draw, right? And I laugh about this. Like, if you can't draw that line, well, you have no line, right? The devil. And I know that the devil, by the way, for what it's worth, is one that embraces your individual hedonism. But like the devil now, the embodiment of all evil, again, are we to believe that the devil is evil, but he actually is woke and he's totally racially, enlightened, and he's totally accepting of your individual identity? And once everyone's roasting in hell, don't worry, he'll make sure to fly your appropriate flag. I think regardless of your identity, we might all be best served to draw our line at Satan. But anyway, here's Sam Smith attempting to provoke, right? And in the end, it's kind of sad because it's not that provocative. I mean, it is to the extent that, like, here's open Satanism, but think about the lines in the envelope that has to be pushed now, Like, what is truly in normal American, not just pop culture, but in normal American culture, what's truly rebellious anymore? I mean, every line's been pushed. When we were growing up, I was talking with somebody the other day, when we were growing up, like, what percentage of people had a tattoo, right? It looked rebellious to have a tattoo. What is it now? I don't have the stats in front of me. I would love to know. What percentage of the population has tattoos now? I mean, I don't know. I mean, 50-50? It feels like a 50-50 proposition. And it certainly doesn't feel rebellious when you see a tattoo. I mean, like, not at all. Neither is hair dye. Neither is piercings. None of it feels rebellious anymore. In normie American culture, everything has just about been exhausted. In order to push the envelope, you got to push it towards, the truly extreme. I'm not a boy anymore. I'm a girl. Gender is fluid. In order to find some edge now, the way it's working now in casual American culture, you got to cut your genitalia off. Now you're a rebel. Now you're forcing people to reassess their cultural assumptions. Now you got to really embrace actually being the devil, says Tubby Sam Smith, to find the edge. But here's the weird thing. Even once you get there, you're not. Because society goes, oh, how great. Dallas Sports Talk Radio goes, get over it, conservative Christian. Oh, you're so predictable. Children celebrate your gender fluidity. Parents tolerate your cultural your chemical castration. There's nothing edgy. Truly, you want to be edgy in American culture? You want to be rebellious? You want to be independent? Be a man, like, legitimately. If you are a man, be a man. Embodies the virtues of manhood. Get a job. Raise a family. Be monogamous. Be virtuous. That truly is rebellious. And society treats it as such. It'll call you toxic. It'll call you patriarchal. It'll call you a throwback to the 1950s. Society will ostracize you for traditional family structure. If somebody went out on the stage of the Grammys and actually elevated, I don't know, even Christianity to the same level of Satanism there, what do you think Dallas Sports Talk Radio would have done? Oh, my God. Why do you have to preach to us? Why do you have to give us your message? It would have been rejected. Like a true rebel. You want to be rebellious? Be virtuous. You want to be rebellious? Stick your rudder in. Dig for the truth. And it does affect your life. We can talk about the way normies are manipulated by the casual wave of news, and it doesn't even resonate when we're talking about Ukraine, even though it potentially leads to war. It doesn't resonate when we talk about the Twitter files, even though it affects what you're allowed to think. It doesn't resonate, even when we pick presidents. And here's the scary thing. It doesn't even resonate when it comes to your personal choices and health. Because the same Twitter files story, the same casual news wave of news that was applied to Ukraine or applied to Joe Biden or applied to the 2020 election was applied to COVID. There's a headline out yesterday in the Associated Press. 1 million kids, 1 million, have been lost to the public school system through COVID shutdowns. Now, some of them went to private school. That's what happened with my kids. Some of them went on to homeschooling. And some of them, they can't account for. Vaccine injury is becoming a real and legitimate conversation and will continue to be. But no one wanted to question it. We wanted to trust. We wanted to ride the wave. We wanted to go along to raise our families and get our jobs. Even when going along to raise our families was compromised by our inability to stick our rudder in and find the truth. Covering our children's faces, kicking them out of school, desocializing them, allowing fentanyl to pour into the country, depressing them, suicide rates going up, injecting unnecessary medications into their arms, and still, we the normie go along. Hey, did y'all see KD got traded to the Suns? It makes you wonder at what point would someone be willing to stick in their rudder and go with some level of independence. Hold on. What's true? You know, they say when Jim Jones of the famous Jonestown massacre in South America, the religious cult from America that took off for South America, and when Jim Jones told his flock to drink the red Kool-Aid, which ended up killing them all, it wasn't a mystery. You know, maybe to the first 10. But there was hundreds. I don't remember what the total number was. Did it reach 1,000 of people that drank the Kool-Aid? And the people later on in the line, you know, saw what was happening to the people at the front of the line. They saw the violent vomiting. They saw the death. And what did they do? They continued to march forward to get their cup and to hand cups to their children. Makes you really wonder where we as a people are if we don't stick our rudder in. What's our line? We sit here and look with such condescension into history as our morally inferiors. We do, all the time, on everything. And one of the ways that we have done that, and one of the things that we've asked is, how did the normal German just sit there? They knew what was going on, at least those in the villages right around the concentration camps. How did they just go along? What happened to their morality? How did they just ride the wave of this horrific historical event? Do you really think that we have established a line? Oh, we can go along. Come on, man, like on Dallas Sports Radio. That's conspiracy, a.k.a. the truth. That's absurd, a.k.a. it's tomorrow's news. We can just go along. Just a few more steps and we're at the front to drink the Kool-Aid. Just a few more decades, you look around and you don't wonder how a society in the 1930s got so lost. You know? Not if we cannot reach with the truth, asking them to dig in their rudders. The normie. Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain podcast for full episodes right now.